Hello, and welcome back to the podcast search tutorial series here on Turbo 360. In the previous video, we organized our UI into React components such that this layout here is rendering all React components and deployed to staging to make sure everything works on staging as well. And as you can see, this is coming from staging right now. In this video, we're going to remove the static component rendering here and populate this with more dynamic data from within the React layout. So let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to run the local server, so npm run serve, and I'm also going to run the development build on Webpack, so npm run dev. Let's head over to localhost and make sure everything still looks the same, which it does, so we're good to go. So let's head back to our entry point from the src folder. So inside the entry point here, we have our podcasts showing up in the sidebar over here, and our episodes showing up in the main UI over here. Clearly, this is all static data, so this is not going to be quite robust enough for our purposes. So let's go ahead and set up some state to maintain the data for each one of these podcasts rows and episodes. So we're going to need an array for each one of those. So we're going to need one array for podcasts and another one for episodes. And excuse me, each one of these will contain a list of JSON objects for each podcast showing up here and each episode showing up here. So these are going to be JSON objects. And let's see, each podcast requires an image, a name, and we're going to call these categories. So let's go with an image. Let's add an ID here as well. Image, name, image, and categories, which will be an array of strings. And then let's just do 3 of these, change the ID, and we'll call these podcast 1, 2, and 3. Let's go with sports, entertainment, news, politics, and business, economy. Okay, so these will be our 3, and then let's use the same image for all 3 of those. Actually, there's no reason why we couldn't do person 1, 2, and 3. We're going to make these relative file paths. It doesn't really make a big difference, but this is a better practice anyway. Okay, so we have our 3 sort of fake podcasts for now. Let's go ahead and render these instead of this same list over here. We need names for all these too. Oh no, we do. Podcast 1, 2, and 3. Okay, so here, instead of just showing up 4 every single time, what we want to do is we want to map through the array of podcasts. And for each one of these, we want to return a podcast component like that, which should work right now as it is, but each one of these, every time you're mapping through an array and returning a component, that component needs a key property. That's a React requirement, and so that's why we actually gave it and each podcast an ID like so, because the key property has to be unique. So now that we have that, we should be able to reload the UI and check. So now we're getting this a couple more times, 1 for each item in the podcast array. So we can get rid of these 3. and we should still have the 3 from the array left over. And so that's a better way of rendering an array rather than just hard coding it like this, which is not really a good practice. So I'm going to take advantage of some ES6 syntax here. Instead of returning like that, we can just do it like that, and that should be fine. And let's get this curly brace up here too. And that should be good. Okay. And then what we need to do now is pass the podcast here into the podcast row component. So I'm going to do that using some destructuring here like that. And so now the podcast row component will have access to the properties of each podcast as it loops through the array. So those properties are name, image, and categories. So what we can do next is head over to the podcast row and grab each one, name, image, and categories, like that from the props, and then we can render the name here instead of the hard-coded name. So we can do that instead, and we should have podcast 1, 2, and 3. We can also do the same with the image. So now we have 3 separate images, and we can do the same thing with the categories, but don't forget this is an array, right? So what we want to do is we want to join the array with a comma and space so that we see sports, entertainment, news, politics, so forth and so on. I think I spelled economy is wrong here. Let's go ahead and fix that. Economy. There we go. So now we have our 3 podcasts with their unique metadata being passed into the podcast row, and that's being held in a podcasts array over here. So that's a much better way of handling that. So let's do the same thing with these episodes. So let's go ahead and fill out some episode JSON data. We'll do 5, and we'll do the same thing. We'll give each one an ID for the same reason. Okay, and then let's go into the episode here and see what we need. We need an image, we need a title, and we need an MP3, a URL for the actual MP3, and we'll worry about these later. So we definitely need an image, a title, and the track. We'll call this track URL. So we need a title, image, and track URL, like that. Okay, and let's go ahead and just copy and paste these in. Okay, and we'll call this track 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 5. Okay, and if we go to the the episode component, we'll see images here. And let's go ahead and populate these. So we have images 1, and we should be able to do the same thing. Just go from 1 through 5. 2, 3, 4, and 5. And we're going to take the episode component and grab the hard-coded string for the MP3 file source right here. And we're just going to reuse this every time for now, just to make life a little bit easier. Okay, so now the same thing. Let's go ahead and map through the episodes array. And let's return an episode component, just like we did with the podcast component. These need a key as well, so don't forget that. and that's why we gave each episode an ID. And we're going to pass the episode itself as a destructured set of properties to the episode component. So I'm going to get rid of these hard-coded ones now. And let's reload and see how that looks. Okay. Everything looks the same because the episode component itself is not using any of these properties. So let's go ahead and take advantage of that. So we have a title, an image, and a track URL. So if we go to the episode component, we can import the title, image, and track URL. And the title shows up here. So let's go ahead and grab that. Okay. And let's see how that looks over here. Oh, looks like we made a mistake. So let's see here. Let's give that a test. Okay, and then we have a title. Let's see what's going on. Episodes, title. And I made a typo right here. That should be episode, not episodes. So I put in an extra S right there as a mistake. We want to pass this in as a destructured property into the episode component. So let's try it again. Now we have track 1, track 2, track 3, 4, and 5. So now let's go ahead and use the rest of the properties. So we also have image. So let's see here, that's going to be, well, let's take care of the image last because that's going to be a bit of a hassle. So let's go ahead and take this. There's the track URL. Let's make sure that still loads. There actually is an actual track here. So here it is, it's playing. Okay, so that worked. And let's deal with the image now. So we have the image, and this is going to be this whole thing here. Let's see. Let's take this whole string right here, and let's create a bg image property out of it. A variable, excuse me, not a property, it's a variable. And let's pass that into here instead, like that. And that should be no change. So let's make sure about that, which it does. And now it's inside that string. Let's go ahead and use the image property itself. So we're going to use a backtick here. So I'm going to do bg image, and I'm going to use backticks here. And we have URL, and then the image itself. So we can use a $sign like that. And then let's see here, I think we're going to need quotation marks right here, like that. And let's use that instead. And let's see how that comes out. Okay, so now we have different images for each track. Let's go ahead and get rid of this. And if you want, you can go ahead and take this and just put it right back here like so. It's probably a cleaner way of handling that. And let's see how that looks. Okay, great. So now we have everything set up for dynamic data, right? So we have two arrays, one for podcasts and one for episodes, and each one of these arrays are what constitutes the visual data that we see over here. And so this is ready to go for a little bit more dynamic integration now. So in the next video, what we're going to do is hook up the search component, the search piece, where when the user enters a search term and then clicks the go button, it's going to run a search query which returns a list of podcasts. And then when the user selects one of these podcasts, the tracks for that particular podcast will show up here, and then you can play an episode and so forth and so on. So this is now prepped for that. So hopefully you got all that working. Before we wrap up, let's do one more production build and throw it up on staging and make sure it works on the staging URL environment as well. So I'm going to turn off both the Webpack here, and I'm going to run a production build. So npm run build. Before you deploy a React project to a hosting environment, you should always give it a production build so that you're running optimized code. And then we're going to do a turbo deploy, and I will pause the video as this is going up. Okay, the deployment is up. Let's head over to staging and take a look at what we get. Okay, so here we are on staging. Everything looks the same, and we're seeing a greater variety of data on the UI, both over here in the podcast as well as the tracks. All the tracks are playing the same actual MP3 file, but it's worth clicking on one just to make sure that it works. And what you did over here, there we go. And yeah, so this is now ready to go for a more dynamic data integration by using a search API and rendering the search results rather than just more static data instead. So hopefully you got all that working. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in part 4.